Right now, if you go to Lenovo's own website and try to buy a ThinkPad X1 Carbon, you'll find something that really shouldn't exist according to 3 decades of how the PC industry has always worked. The exact same laptop, with the same processor, the same screen, and the same body, actually costs less money if you choose Linux instead of Windows. In the United States and Canada, buyers have documented price gaps as large as $140, or roughly 211 Canadian dollars, on the
Lenovo's Windows 10 sales plummeted 90% in a single quarter.
Menu. Once you understand what that price difference actually represents, you start to see why the foundation Microsoft has built its empire on for the last 35 years is beginning to crack in public, in real time, right here in 2026. So today, we're going to break down exactly what's hiding behind that price gap, why this isn't just some strange Lenovo quirk anymore, and why Microsoft's response to all of this tells you a lot about just how worried the company actually is. Let's start with the part that never shows up on any spec sheet.
Lenovo's PC sales account for nearly 30%.
For as long as most of us have been buying computers, Windows was never something you chose, it simply arrived already installed. You barely even saw the decision happening. That arrangement is exactly how Microsoft managed to maintain near total dominance over the consumer PC market for decades, without ever really having to fight for it directly in front of customers. Instead, that fight happened upstream, buried inside licensing deals between Microsoft and manufacturers like Lenovo, HP, Dell.
HP is the world's largest PC manufacturer by
the box long before any customer ever touched a keyboard. What's been slowly happening over roughly the last 2 years is that the gap between what Windows actually costs a manufacturer to include, versus what it delivers in real customer satisfaction, has become genuinely impossible for these companies to keep ignoring. Here's what that licensing fee actually costs in practical terms. Reporting from outlets that closely cover the PC hardware industry has documented that this so-called Windows tax, meaning the bundled licensing fee manufacturers pay Microsoft for every machine that ships with Windows.
HP's Windows pre-installation is a significant market share for PC.
$50 to the total cost of a device, depending on the model and licensing tier involved. For someone buying just one laptop, that's essentially an invisible cost folded directly into the sticker price. But for a company purchasing 50, 100, or even 500 machines at once for an office refresh, that number stops being invisible and becomes a real line item somebody in procurement has to justify. Lenovo, simply by exposing that cost difference right at checkout and
the industry has relied on OEMs to subsidize,
ended up doing something that genuinely wasn't supposed to happen. They made the Windows tax visible at scale, for the very first time, to ordinary consumers comparison shopping on a retail website. Now here's where the timing becomes genuinely impossible to ignore, because none of this is happening in a vacuum. On the 14th of October in 2025, Microsoft officially ended free security support for Windows 10, a date that had already been circled on calendars across the entire.
China's PC sales have been growing at a rate of 10% annually.
Own published lifecycle documentation, hundreds of millions of devices running Windows 10 worldwide suddenly faced a real choice: either pay for extended security updates, buy new hardware that actually meets Windows 11's much stricter requirements, or step off Microsoft's upgrade treadmill altogether. And Windows 11 itself hasn't exactly made that third option look unattractive either. Multiple independent tracking services have documented that Windows 11 adoption climbed far more slowly than Microsoft originally projected following its October 2021 launch, repeatedly missing internal targets.
Windows 11 has a market share of around 4.6%.
Hadn't come anywhere close to the kind of dominant majority share that Windows 10 held at the equivalent point in its own lifecycle, and a meaningful portion of the installed base was still actively avoiding the upgrade, even after Microsoft cut off free support completely. So what's actually driving this reluctance, and why does it matter so much to manufacturers specifically, rather than just frustrated individual users? Windows 11's hardware requirements didn't just annoy consumers, they directly inflated.
Lenovo's annual profit declined by 28% in 2022.
The mandatory TPM 2.0 security chip requirement, the restriction to newer generation processors, and the higher minimum RAM thresholds all get baked directly into the bill of materials before a manufacturer ever sets a retail price on a budget laptop where margins were already razor thin. Those forced component upgrades eat directly into profitability on every unit sold. And that's before you even factor in support costs, meaning the ongoing expense of staffing call centers to handle customers whose printers stopped working.
Over 1 billion PCs worldwide use Windows, a staggering
crawl after an automatic Windows upgrade, customers whose first complaint goes straight to the manufacturer's own support line rather than Microsoft's, simply because it's the manufacturer's logo printed on the lid. Put all of that together, the licensing fee, the inflated component costs, the support burden, and now the visible price comparison Lenovo has placed directly in front of shoppers, and you start to see why this isn't really a story about one company making one pricing decision. It's a story about an economic relationship between Microsoft and the hardware industry that's been quietly under strain for years.
Over 1 billion Windows 10 devices still active worldwide.
Forced an entire generation of users to make a real choice about their next computer for the first time in nearly a decade. And once you understand that backdrop, the question stops being whether Microsoft is annoyed about a discounted ThinkPad listing. The real question becomes how far this exact pattern actually extends beyond Lenovo, and that's precisely where we're heading next. So Lenovo exposed this price gap, but here's the question that genuinely matters most. Is this an isolated pricing experiment, or is something much bigger?
Lenovo's PC market share has dropped to 24.9%.
Once you start digging into what Dell, HP, and Asus have each been quietly doing over roughly that same window of time, the picture stops looking like one outlier company and starts looking like a genuine pattern. Dell has actually offered Ubuntu pre-installed on select laptops for years, through what it officially calls its Developer Edition program, originally aimed at engineers and developers who wanted a certified, fully supported Linux machine right out of the box. What's changed isn't that Dell suddenly discovered Linux exists, it's that the company has continued expanding which models carry that option, and has
Dell's revenue drops 19% in 2022 amid declining
facing laptop pages well into 2026, backed by the same limited hardware warranty Dell offers on its Windows machines. That's a meaningful signal, because a company doesn't keep an entire support and warranty infrastructure running for a product line it considers a dead-end project. HP's situation tells a somewhat different, but related story. HP has historically been far more conservative than Dell about offering consumer-facing Linux options at scale, leaning instead toward Windows across nearly its entire mainstream lineup, while mostly reserving Linux.
HP's PC sales surpassed Microsoft's in 2020,
technical professionals who specifically request it. But the fact that this conversation is even happening at all inside HP's product strategy, that Linux compatibility on professional workstation hardware has become something the company actively documents and supports rather than quietly tolerates, tells you that the calculation around Windows licensing costs versus alternative operating systems has become a genuine, live internal debate at the second largest PC manufacturer on the planet, rather than some settled question nobody bothers revisiting. And Asus has leaned even further into the open-source hardware community.
Lenovo's market share has consistently surpassed HP in recent years.
Ubuntu and other major distributions, reflecting years of work optimizing component selection so Linux runs cleanly, without the driver headaches that used to make non-Windows laptops such a frustrating gamble for ordinary buyers. Here's exactly why none of these companies can really afford to make this move loudly or entirely alone. And it's a dynamic worth understanding because it explains why this shift has unfolded so gradually instead of all at once. Microsoft's licensing relationships with major manufacturers have
HP's market share has declined by 16% since 2020.
And various forms of preferential treatment tied to how aggressively a manufacturer promotes Windows as the default choice across its lineup. A single manufacturer publicly declaring war on that relationship risks real retaliation, the kind that shows up in future licensing terms or less favorable treatment on future negotiations. But if multiple major manufacturers each quietly expand their Linux offerings around roughly the same window of time, exposing Windows tax pricing gaps the way Lenovo has,
Dell's revenue dropped 12% in the past quarter due to the switch.
The dynamic changes entirely. Microsoft simply cannot realistically retaliate against manufacturers that collectively account for the overwhelming majority of global PC shipments, without seriously damaging its own distribution network. So instead of one company making one loud declaration, what we're actually watching is several companies independently arriving at similar conclusions through their own internal cost analysis, creating exactly the kind of distributed pressure that's much harder for Microsoft to push back against. Now, here's the part of this story that should genuinely.
Lenovo's PC sales account for 45% of global market share.
The developer and enterprise community right now, the audience that ultimately determines which platforms become genuinely indispensable over the next decade. While American consumers were quietly noticing these price gaps on Lenovo's website, an entirely separate, and far more consequential, rebellion against Windows has been unfolding across European governments. This part of the story doesn't get nearly enough attention, because it isn't happening in a retail checkout cart. It's happening within the actual machinery of national governments deciding they no longer fully trust an American company with their data.
Lenovo dominates global PC market share with over 50%.
Schleswig-Holstein, which announced its plan to migrate away from Microsoft entirely back in 2024, and has since turned that announcement into one of the most closely watched public sector technology transitions in Europe. By the end of 2025, the state government confirmed it had successfully moved roughly 80% of its workplaces, around 30,000 desktops, away from Microsoft Office and onto LibreOffice. They also completed a full migration of more than 40,000 email accounts and over 100 million messages and calendar entries off Microsoft Exchange and Outlook.
HP's PC sales declined by 20% in 2020.
Actively piloting a full desktop switch from Windows to Linux involving roughly 150 users, including the state's own digital affairs minister using it as his primary machine. According to the state's own announcements, this transition is projected to save more than €15 million annually starting in 2026, against a one-time €9 million investment. In February of 2026, Schleswig-Holstein became the first regional government in the world to formally endorse the United Nations open-source principles, turning what started as a budget decision into a genuine.
China's PC market share surpassed the US for the first time in 2020.
And Germany is far from alone. In April of 2026, France's Minister for Public Accounts announced a plan to migrate the computers of roughly 2.5 million French civil servants away from Microsoft and onto Linux-based systems, explicitly framing the decision around digital sovereignty rather than cost savings alone. Though industry estimates suggest the government's existing Microsoft licensing arrangement could run between €500 million and €800 million annually. France isn't approaching this without precedent either, since the country's national gendarmerie has.
Lenovo is the world's largest PC manufacturer by market.
103,000 computers on a customized Ubuntu-based system for well over a decade, proving the operational viability of large-scale government Linux deployment long before this latest announcement. Austria's military has been completing a parallel migration away from Microsoft Office toward LibreOffice. Denmark's Ministry of Digital Affairs announced its own shift away from Microsoft. And at a winter 2025 summit on European digital sovereignty, all 27 European Union member states formally adopted a charter explicitly promoting open-source software adoption as a content.
Global PC market share has declined to 15% in the past year alone.
Full of idealistic technologists anymore. This is becoming coordinated, formalized European Union policy. Part of what's driving this traces directly back to genuine regulatory friction between Microsoft and European authorities. In 2024, the European Data Protection Supervisor formally ruled that the European Commission's own use of Microsoft 365 violated GDPR, a finding that gave enormous legal and political cover to officials across the continent who wanted justification to move away from American cloud software.
EU's antitrust regulator fines Microsoft $2.2 billion in 2019.
65 violates EU competition rules, echoing the kind of antitrust scrutiny that resulted in a €561 million fine against Microsoft back in 2013. And underlying nearly all of this is growing European discomfort with the United States Cloud Act, legislation that allows U.S. authorities to compel American companies to hand over data even when it's physically stored on servers outside the United States, a reality European officials increasingly view as fundamentally incompatible with genuine data sovereignty. None of this is happening without real
Gigabyte's profit margins could be severely impacted by this,
rather than presenting these migrations as guaranteed successes. The city of Munich famously pioneered a large-scale government Linux migration starting in the early 2000s, moving roughly 15,000 municipal workstations onto a custom Ubuntu-based system. That project ran for years and was held up internationally as proof of concept, until political pressure, user resistance, and integration headaches led the city to begin reversing course back toward Windows starting around 2017. Schleswig-Holstein's own digital affairs minister has
Microsoft's share price plummeted 5% in one day after the announcement.
Stressful periods for state employees and ongoing technical hurdles. So this isn't a clean, friction-free story of inevitable victory for Linux over Windows in the public sector. It's a genuinely contested, actively unfolding experiment, with real financial incentives and geopolitical motivations pushing one direction, and real organizational inertia and technical complexity pushing back in the other. But step back and look at the scale of what's moving simultaneously across an entire continent in this same window of 2025 and 2026.
Germany's Schleswig-Holstein has a population of approximately 2.9 million.
Microsoft Office while piloting a full Windows to Linux switch. France committing to move 2.5 million government desktops off Microsoft entirely. Austria, Denmark, and the Netherlands running parallel initiatives. And the entire European Union formally adopting open source promotion as continental policy through a charter signed by all 27 member states. This is happening at the exact same moment American hardware manufacturers are independently exposing the cost of the Windows.
Lenovo owns 25% of the global PC market share.
Offerings. Two completely separate pressure campaigns, one driven by consumer economics in the United States and Canada, the other driven by government policy and data sovereignty concerns across Europe, converging on the same conclusion from entirely different directions in roughly the same 18-month window. And that convergence is exactly what should worry Microsoft most, because it suggests this isn't a temporary pricing dispute that gets resolved with a better discount offer. It's the early shape of something genuinely structural. Let's pull this together.
Lenovo accounts for 40% of global PC sales, making it large
manufacturers and government sovereignty moves in Europe. It's simultaneously fighting a credibility battle with its own shareholders over whether its entire AI strategy is actually working. On the 29th of January in 2026, Microsoft's stock dropped sharply after the company reported that Azure's cloud growth had slowed to between 37 and 38% for the upcoming quarter, down from the pace investors had grown used to. While capital expenditures simultaneously surged 66% year-over-year to a record $37.5 billion for that single quarter.
HP's AI investment has surpassed $5 billion in just 2 years.
Infrastructure, while the actual cloud business that infrastructure is supposed to support showed its first real signs of deceleration in years. Microsoft's own CFO acknowledged that data center depreciation is actively compressing gross margins, and that pressure is expected to continue for several more quarters. By the time the stock hit a one-year low this spring, with capital expenditure projected at roughly $190 billion for 2026, analysts were openly questioning when or whether that spending actually converts into returns that justify the scale of the bet. To be fair,
over 1 billion PCs use Windows worldwide.
Microsoft's later fiscal third quarter results, reported in late April of 2026, actually beat expectations, with Azure growth re-accelerating back to 40% and annualized AI revenue crossing $37 billion, up a striking 123% year-over-year, alongside a contracted backlog north of $627 billion. Even with those strong numbers, the stock still fell on the news, because investors have shifted from pricing Microsoft as though AI revenue would arrive immediately toward grappling with the reality that
Lenovo's annual PC sales exceed 50 million units globally.
Flow in the middle of it. One analyst captured the mood bluntly, comparing Microsoft and fellow AI heavyweight Meta to companies wearing winter jackets to the beach in summer, spending heavily on a build-out the market hasn't yet seen translate into proportional growth. Underneath all of that capital spending sits the exact same product tension we've been tracing through this entire story. Satya Nadella's vision of Windows itself evolving into what he's repeatedly called an agentic operating system, one that anticipates user needs and takes autonomous.
Lenovo's market share fell to 27.1% in 2022 due to
directly on top of an operating system whose core hardware requirements, support costs, and AI feature rollouts have already been driving manufacturers and European governments alike toward the exit. This is the trap Microsoft finds itself in right now. The company's entire growth narrative for the next several years depends on convincing the market that Windows and its broader software ecosystem are becoming smarter and more deeply integrated with AI infrastructure that costs staggering amounts of money to build. But the actual
HPE is the world's largest PC manufacturer, producing
and pushing European governments toward open-source sovereignty isn't a complaint about insufficient AI features. It's the opposite. It's frustration with bloated licensing costs, inflated hardware requirements, unpredictable AI behavior baked into a core operating system, and a documented history of features like recall raising serious enough privacy concerns that Microsoft had to delay and rebuild the feature before launch. Every dollar Microsoft pours into proving its AI bet to Wall Street is a dollar invested in exactly the direction that's making Windows.
Global PC shipments have declined by 10% in the past year,
simultaneously pulling away on two separate continents. So here's where that leaves things as of mid-2026. We know Lenovo has made the Windows licensing tax visible to consumers at retail scale, with documented price gaps as high as $140 on identical hardware. We know Dell has maintained and expanded its certified Ubuntu offerings for years, and Asus laptops have become reliable fixtures across Linux compatibility communities. We know Windows 10's October 2025 end-of-life forced an entire
Lenovo accounted for 40% of the world's PC market share in 2020.
First time in nearly a decade, right as Windows 11 adoption continued lagging Microsoft's own projections. And we know, with far more certainty, that Germany's Schleswig-Holstein has already completed an 80% migration away from Microsoft software, that France has committed to moving 2.5 million government desktops onto Linux, and that the entire European Union formally adopted open-source promotion as continental policy through a charter signed by all 27 member states. None of these threads alone topples a company as massive as Microsoft.
Lenovo accounts for over 20% of the global PC market share and
profitable software companies on the planet, with revenues still growing in double digits. But taken together, across consumer retail pricing, government policy, and the company's own AI capital spending fight with Wall Street, what you're watching isn't a single crisis. It's three simultaneous pressure points converging on the exact same product, at the exact same moment, for the first time in Microsoft's modern history. Whether 2026 ends up marking the actual beginning of Windows losing its default status, or simply another bruising but survivable chapter,
Lenovo's PC market share drops to 24.9% in Q2.
Microsoft can find a way to make its AI-first vision for Windows actually serve the people paying for it, rather than the other way around. What do you think? Is this the real start of a genuine shift away from Windows? Or is Microsoft too deeply embedded in the PC ecosystem to actually lose this fight? Let me know in the comments, and if you want to stay ahead of exactly how this keeps unfolding, the subscribe button is right there waiting for you.